The title for this lecture is The Consequences of Second London Confession, Chapter 7, in paragraph 1. And this is a paragraph that so far in my lectures has been a little bit neglected. It's an important paragraph, though, in our confession of faith, and it's one that I think is very often read past too quickly, read over too quickly, and perhaps not understood. What is it actually saying, and why does it matter? And so I want to explain the theology of this chapter, as well as its historical context, so that we can better confess it and teach it to our people in our churches. And so the first thing that we need to do as we consider chapter 7 in paragraph 1 is compare it to the preceding documents on which it is based, because there's a difference between the Westminster Confession of Faith and the Savoy Declaration and our Confession of Faith. Now, I know I mentioned the Savoy Declaration yesterday, but just in case you're unfamiliar with what I'm referring to, in 1646, the Westminster Assembly submitted its Confession of Faith to Parliament, the humble advice of the Assembly of Divines to the Parliament. And so the Westminster Confession of Faith is humble advice to Parliament, hoping that Parliament will approve it as the state religion of the land. Parliament edited various portions of it and then approved it. We never see that version. It was very rarely published since then. The original version was published in Scotland, and that's what we know as the Westminster Confession. So you have the original Westminster Confession, which really came to us through Scotland. You have the Parliament-edited version of the Westminster Confession. And then in 1658, the Congregationalists, like John Owen and Thomas Goodwin, they came together in the Savoy Conference and published their own confession of faith called the Savoy Declaration. And so 1646, the Westminster Confession of Faith. In 1658, the Savoy Declaration. And the Savoy Declaration takes the majority of the Westminster Confession of Faith and uses those words, changing just some things. In 1677, the Particular Baptists published their Confession of Faith, which uses the Savoy Declaration and the Westminster Confession of Faith, all those same words and paragraphs, for our Confession of Faith. So the textual history of our confession is first in the Savoy Declaration in 1658, then in the Westminster Confession, and they used the Parliament edition in 1646. Remember that there is no such thing as the 1689 Confession. It was never published in 1689. There is no 1689 Confession. Sorry. Particular Baptist's hardest hit. 1,000 websites and things need to be changed. Tattoos, yeah. Why is it called the 1689 Confession of Faith then? Well, and many of you may already know this, so just hear Grandpa's story again. We mentioned in a previous lecture yesterday that the 1677 was published anonymously for fear of persecution. Well, in 1689, the Act of Toleration was passed, where nonconformists are not going to be punished for holding their own assemblies that are different from the doctrine and the practice of the Church of England. So in 1689, nonconformists have freedom to be themselves and to worship in their own assemblies without fear of reprisal. That is the first year that the Baptists held their General Assembly. So Baptist ministers and ministering brethren, gifted brethren from all around the country, over 100 congregations, sent their messengers to a General Assembly at Broken Wharf in London in 1689. And at the end of that General Assembly, they published a short narrative of their assembly saying, this is what we did at our assembly, these are who our churches are, this is where they all are. They list the counties of England and all the churches in those counties and the names of their ministers, which would be a hit list just a year before. So they publish all their names, their locations of their churches, and what they did at their assembly. And in this narrative, they specifically mention the confession of faith and say, we own this confession as belonging to us. It represents our faith and practice. So they're stepping into the light to say this confession that's been out for 12 years already, it was published in 77, then again in 88. In 89, they have their first GA, and that is where they publicly declare, this is our confession. So if you call it the 1689 Confession, that's fine. It is the 1689 Confession. It just was never, ever published in 1689. Which is all to say that as we come to chapter 7 in paragraph 1, we should consider its textual history. Chapter 7, paragraph 1 says this: "The distance between God and the creature is so great that although reasonable creatures do owe obedience unto him as their creator, yet they could never have attained the reward of life but by some voluntary condescension on God's part, which he hath been pleased to express by way of covenant." Now, the Westminster Confession says something different. Ours and the Savoy Declaration are the same. The Westminster Confession says all the same words except for one phrase. "The distance between God and the creature is so great that although reasonable creatures do owe obedience unto him as their creator, yet they could never have," here's the difference, "yet they could never have any fruition of him as their blessedness and reward, but by some voluntary condescension on God's part, which he hath been pleased to express by way of covenant." So the difference is between the reward of life and any fruition of him as their blessedness and reward. Now, what's the difference between these paragraphs? Is there a difference in doctrine, and what are the advantages or disadvantages of the differences? Well, we have to pause that question, consider what this paragraph is actually teaching, and then come back to the question to analyze the wisdom of it, or the advantages or disadvantages of it. So, pause, and we're going to move on to the second point in the lecture, the theology, the doctrinal content of Second London Confession, chapter 7, and paragraph 1. What do we confess in this paragraph? What is its theology? And there's three basic truths that are asserted in chapter 7, paragraph 1. Basic truths, simple truths. First, chapter 7, paragraph 1 confesses that creatures owe God absolute obedience. Creatures owe God absolute obedience. Man, being a rational creature, owes God absolute obedience. So the perspective here is one of creator and creature. Because God made all things, man included, he is our creator, he is our God, he is the God of this world, the God of the universe, and we, being his creatures, we owe him our absolute and total obedience. Full stop. It's not relative, it's absolute. Absolute meaning on its own, pure and simple. We owe God obedience. We are his, he made us, we belong to him. He is our Lord, our sovereign, and our King. Chapter 2 and paragraph 3 has already asserted this. Chapter 2, which speaks of God and the Holy Trinity, paragraph 3 says, "To him is due from angels and men," those are rational creatures, the only rational creatures. "To him is due from angels and men whatsoever worship, service, or obedience as creatures they owe unto the Creator, and whatever he is further pleased to require of them." So notice that there is a natural obedience which man owes to God by virtue of the creator-creature relationship. This is referring to natural law. Creatures must live by the natural law of the Creator who made them. And the confession points out in chapter 2, paragraph 3, "and whatever he is further pleased to require of them." What is in addition to natural law? Pastor Walter mentioned it last night in the panel discussion. That would be positive law. So we have a natural obligation to obey God's natural law, moral law, and whatever else he requires of us, positive law, we are required to obey it. The thing commanded is indifferent. Positive laws are indifferent in themselves. They're not natural or moral. But we have an obligation to obey them because our obligation is to God. He has commanded it, therefore we must obey it. We must obey our God in all moral and positive commands. Absolutely, not relatively. Secondly, chapter 7, paragraph 1 asserts in the second place that God owes creatures no reward for their obedience. In our natural relationship to God, we owe him complete obedience in natural and positive law. But God owes no reward back to man for his obedience. Now, we can say that God's justice would approve our obedience. His justice would say, "You have done that which is commanded," but it does not reward our obedience. We don't gain anything from God for the obedience that we have given to God. God owes us nothing in return for our obedience. Why? Well, because we have only done that which we were required to do. And because we have not given anything unto him which he did not already have. Let's survey some texts. I've put the references in your outline, but we should read them together. So open with me, if you will, to Job chapter 35. Job 35. And in Job 35, Elihu is speaking. You always have to be careful when you quote from Job, don't you? Because a lot of it will be wrong. Job and his friends are mistaken, or they're confused. There's truth in what they say, but often not quite complete truth or confused truth. And so here, just to reassure you, Elihu is speaking in chapter 35, verses 5 to 8. Job and his friends keep trying to discern why so many calamities have befallen Job. And their discussions keep swirling around whether Job has done something to make God bring these afflictions on him. And Job is insisting that he has not. I have not done anything that would cause God to bring these afflictions on me. But then Job is saying, but if I've been innocent, shouldn't this exempt me from suffering? Shouldn't I sort of have as a reward for my righteousness to not have to experience these things? And he and his friends can't quite figure out, if you didn't do something wicked to bring about this suffering, but your righteousness or innocence also didn't exempt you from suffering, what is the purpose? What is the reason and explanation for these things? So Job and his friends are thinking in terms of our obedience and our disobedience must be affecting and changing God. Our obedience or disobedience must be the explanation for why God is causing or not causing certain things to happen in our lives. Elihu says, you're all wrong. Verses 5 to 8. Look at the heavens and see, and behold the clouds which are higher than you. If you have sinned, what do you accomplish against him, against God? And if your transgressions are multiplied, what do you do to God? If you are righteous, what do you give to God? Or what does God receive from your hand? Your wickedness concerns a man like yourself, and your righteousness a son of man. So Elihu says, look to the heavens. God is above you. Your disobedience and your obedience, it's dealing with men around you. God is not changed by your wickedness. God is not changed by your righteousness. Your wickedness does not take away from God. Your righteousness does not add to God. The truth is that nothing can detract from God, and nothing can add to God. Impassibility is being taught here. The God who has decreed whatsoever comes to pass is not responding to my wickedness in the flow of time, nor is he responding to my righteousness. Good job, Sam. Here you go. No. Not only is it God's decree which has already been decreed, and we see it unfolding in time, but it's God's one simple eternal act. Not only is that true and in place, and not only is impassibility in place, but also this connects to God's felicity, or God's glory or blessedness. As the scriptures say, he who is forever blessed. My sin does not somehow diminish God's blessedness. He's blessed in and of himself. And my righteousness does not increase God's blessedness. He is blessed in and of himself. So aseity, felicity, impassibility, the divine decree, all of these things Elihu is saying, take some theology proper, Job and your friends, and come back when you've learned. He is making the point that our Creator is beyond us. He says, your wickedness concerns a man like yourself, and your righteousness a son of man. Well, in a later chapter, God reinforces the same thing to Job. Look at chapter 41, Job 41 and verse 11. God says, who has first given to me that I should repay him? Whatever is under the whole heaven is mine. Whatever we give to God is already his. He does not need us to give it to him in order for him to have it. Who quotes this? Paul does in Romans chapter 11. In Romans 11:35-36, Paul says, "Or who has given a gift to him that he might be repaid? For from him, and through him, and to him are all things. To him be glory forever." Paul quotes from Job 41:11, and he says, "Praised be God who has all things. From him and through him and to him are all things. Who has given him a gift that he might be repaid?" So our obedience does not indebt God, because God has not received something from me. He's not received anything from me which he did not already have. Paul teaches this to the Athenians in Acts chapter 17, verses 24-25. Paul said to them, "The God who made the world and everything in it, being Lord of heaven and earth," here the categories of creator and sovereign dominion, "the God who made the world and everything in it, being Lord of heaven and earth, does not live in temples made by man, nor is he served by human hands as though he needed anything, since he himself gives to all mankind life and breath and everything." All that we have received from God. We can't give to him something as though he needed it. And Jesus teaches the same thing in Luke chapter 17, verses 9-10. "Does the master thank the servant because he did what was commanded? So you also, when you have done all that you were commanded, say, 'We are unworthy servants. We have only done what was our duty.' Other older translations say, 'We are unprofitable servants.' Our duty does not profit us. It does not give us a net reward. It does not advance us beyond our condition as servants. When you do what you are commanded or obligated to do, your obedience does not elevate you above the arrangement already set in place. When the servant serves the master does not now become the servant who owes something to the servant. In Calvin and Hobbes, the source of all greatness and wisdom, Calvin is asked by his parents to bring them a pencil or something. And then the next square shows Calvin doing this, looking at his mom, waiting for a tip. He goes, he coughs, saying, "Aren't you going to tip me for bringing you this pencil?" And the parent just said, "Get out of here. That's ridiculous. I don't owe you anything. You're my son. You have to do this. You have to bring me that pencil because I said so, because I'm your parent and you're my child. You do not get a reward just for bringing me something when you have to already." It's an illustration of the fact that servants live in a particular kind of relationship to their master. The master provides shelter and food for them, and they care for the master's goods. It is the master's goods that they are taking care of. And so as they take care of the master's goods, their obedience does not make them the master of the goods or the master of the master. As they live as servants, they continue as servants. They do not advance themselves beyond the station of servant by being a servant. They simply do their duty and say, "We are unworthy or unprofitable servants." And so now think about if a master and servant or parent and child relationship is so, now raise your eyes to the heavens, as Elihu said, and think about the creator-creature relationship. We owe God absolute obedience. He does not owe us a reward. When we serve our master, we do not then give him anything. We do not take anything away from him. We do not indebt him. We do not become the masters. We remain his creatures who must obey him. This brings us in the third place to the fact that in 2 London Confession 7.1, it teaches us that through covenant, God gives blessings to man which would otherwise be unobtainable by man. It has pleased God in the history of the world to make covenants with man. And every single covenant offers blessings to mankind. Blessings which would be unavailable and unobtainable apart from God freely and graciously making them available in covenant. God voluntarily, of his own will, condescends. He shows kindness to those below him by covenanting blessings to them which they could not obtain merely by virtue of their relationship to him as creatures or their obedience unto him in that relationship. Every covenant offers blessings. The covenant of works offers glorification to man. The Noahic covenant offers man sustained seasons and stabilized life. The Abrahamic covenant offers the land of Canaan, multiplied descendants, the birth of the Christ. The Mosaic covenant offers blessed life in that land for that multiplied people and a means of regaining ceremonial purity when lost. The Davidic covenant offers the kingship to David and his sons and an eternal throne for the faithful descendant. The new covenant offers Christ and in him every spiritual blessing in the heavenly places. All of these blessings, all of these promises, where do they come from? They come from God covenanting them to man. None of these things could be claimed or attained by man apart from God voluntarily of his own will condescending to make these blessings available for mankind. And how has he been pleased to do this in the history of the world? Through covenant. Notice that our confession states that a reward was unobtainable except by way of covenant. You cannot claim a reward, a payment, a salary for your work or for your obedience unless God makes your obedience of such a nature that it will merit or earn or obtain that reward. If God says do this and get that, then by virtue of the covenantal arrangement, your doing of this will get that. And this reward for your doing only is the case because of covenant. Just like yesterday we read in John Brinsley, he said that the animal sacrifices were efficacious not by virtue of the animal blood itself, but because of God's institution that made the animal blood efficacious to cleanse the flesh of ceremonial guilt. It's the same idea that our obedience can obtain, can receive, or obtain is a better word, can obtain a specified reward in covenant because God has made it so. Let's read some authors from the 17th century to prove that this is the appropriate understanding of chapter 7, paragraph 1. First, Nehemiah Cox, a good friend. He says, a covenant implies a free and sovereign act of the divine will, voluntary, exerted in condescending love and goodness. It is not from any necessity of nature that God enters into covenant with men, but of his own good pleasure. Such a privilege and nearness to God, as is included in covenant interest, cannot immediately result from the relation which they have to God as creatures. No, not as reasonable creatures, though upright and in a perfect state. Pause. Look, if you are upright and perfect and reasonable, even so, the blessings that God gives in covenant are beyond that condition. For the Lord owes not unto man the good promised in any covenant he makes with him antecedently, but his first right therein is freely given him by the promise of the covenant. Benedict Pictet, it is true that speaking strictly, there cannot be any covenant between God and man, because there is no proportion between God and man, and between the goodness of the one and the duty of the other. Because also man is bound without any covenant to pay obedience to God, and is not able of himself to contribute anything towards it. Nor does God owe anything to his creature, or in any way has need of his creature. But God, under the influence of pure kindness, was pleased by means of a covenant to invite his creature into communion with himself. Thomas Manton. Some divines say that in innocency, that is in the state of man before the fall, we could not merit. When the covenant did seem to hang upon works, we could in their sense impetrare, but not merere. That is, we could obtain by virtue of doing, but not deserve. Merit and desert, or deserving, are improper notions to express the relation between the work of a creature and the reward of a creator. Meaning, my obedience is not just so inherently virtuous and valuable that God must reward it with some kind of blessing. No, we obtain by doing because God has covenanted it to be so, but we do not merit or deserve the thing which God has given unto us. Finally, John Owen. The nature of God who makes these covenants requires that so it should be. It becomes his greatness and goodness in all his voluntary transactions with his creatures to propose that unto them wherein their advantage, their happiness, and blessedness consists. Covenants bless man. We inquire not how God may deal with his creatures as such, what he may absolutely require of them on account of his own being, but upon supposition that he will condescend to enter into covenant with his creatures and to come into agreement with them according unto the terms of it, it becomes his greatness and goodness to give them promises as the foundation of it, wherein he proposes unto them the things wherein their blessedness and reward consists. So these quotations help to confirm what we have said as three fundamental theological assertions confessed in chapter 7, paragraph 1, that man owes absolute obedience to God. God owes nothing as a reward back to man, but covenant is precisely the way in which it has pleased God to make blessings available for man that are beyond his created state, that are more than he ever could enjoy purely by virtue of obeying God in the creator-creature relationship. Well, this brings us finally to 6 theological consequences. The title of this lecture is The Consequences of Chapter 7 and Paragraph 1. And so consider 6 implications, theological implications with me, and we'll spend the rest of our time here. In the first place, and notice the way this is stated, Second London Confession, not just chapter 7, paragraph 1, but the confession as a whole, confesses the covenant of works. Notice that in chapter 6, paragraph 1, it says that God created man upright and perfect and gave him a righteous law, a law which had been unto life, had he kept it. A law which has a reward attached to it. If you keep this law, it will be unto life. Then the next chapter, chapter 7, paragraph 1, states that the reward of life is impossible to obtain unless God covenants it, which is precisely what the confession is saying God did. And then in chapter 20, paragraph 1, it says the covenant of works being broken by sin and made unprofitable unto life. Notice unprofitable, unable to produce, unable to provide the reward of life. The covenant of works can no longer provide the reward of life because it's broken, but it did previously provide and promise the reward of life unto obedience, a righteous law which had been unto life. Notice that in chapter 6, paragraph 1, it's a positive law regarding the trees in the garden. God gives Adam a positive law about the trees and says, this law will be unto life if you keep it. If God establishes a positive law, a previously non-binding obligation, a non-existent obligation, and says, if you obey this law, you will receive the reward of life, what does chapter 7 tell you that is? It's a covenant. By virtue of the creator and creature relationship and the distance between God and man, no obedience could obtain a reward unless God makes it so in covenant. And chapter 20, verse 1 names the covenant of works and says that it was once profitable unto life, but it is now no longer. And that's why chapter 7, paragraph 2 goes on to say that life is now obtainable through the covenant of grace. And in paragraph 3, because man is now utterly incapable of acceptance with God upon those terms on which Adam stood in his state of innocency, the terms of the covenant of works. Now, I will not hesitate to say that I believe that there are better ways to have included the covenant of works in our confession of faith, to make it clear, to make it more direct. But let us hear no more about Second London Confession not confessing the covenant of works. It's there in doctrine, it's there in name. And chapter 7, paragraph 1 commits us to say that there can be no reward of life for obedience unless it's a covenant. And in fact, it says, if there is a reward of life for obedience, it has to be a covenant unless you deny the nature of the creator-creature relationship. Secondly, another theological consequence of this paragraph. In my opinion, the Westminster Confession of Faith and our confession and the Savoy Declaration, they're not at odds. Now that we have a better understanding for what chapter 7, paragraph 1 is actually teaching, we can reevaluate the question of the change in language between any fruition of him as their blessedness and reward and the reward of life. No doubt, the Westminster Confession is saying that God is so much greater than the creature that God could never be the reward for man's doing. God himself could never be the reward for man's doing unless he covenants himself to man. If God covenants himself to man because of his obedience, that is such a disparity. That is such an amazing condescension on God's part for God to covenant himself to his creature as the reward of the covenant, as the blessedness of the covenant. And it's true that God does covenant himself to man in the new covenant. The beatific vision is the pinnacle of man's blessedness in the new covenant, which we received through Jesus Christ as the summation of all our blessing, that we will be glorified and able to enjoy the presence of God and to know him in fullness, insofar as a creature is able. The idea that God would covenant himself to us as our blessedness and reward, that is unobtainable and impossible apart from covenant. Yea and amen. That being said, the Westminster Confession states that man could have no fruition of God as their blessedness apart from covenant. And fruition refers to the enjoyment of actual possession. You actually have something and you're enjoying it. That is fruition. You personally possess it and you are presently enjoying its benefits. And so is man incapable of enjoying communion with God and blessedness in relation to him unless by covenant? I think that's where the statement in the Westminster Confession could be poked a bit and say Adam in his state of innocency had communion with God and enjoyed God and a blessed communion. He had blessedness in the natural creator-creature relationship. I think that the Westminster Confession could possibly be taken as in some ways diminishing the glory, the true glory of the natural creator-creature relationship before the fall. Adam did have possession and enjoyment of communion with God simply as an innocent and holy creature, apart from covenant. Covenant gave to him confirmation in this communion, glorification, the reward of life. So no doubt, God can never be man's reward except by covenant. It does seem, nevertheless, like an overstatement to say that man has no fruition of God except by way of covenant. Having said all that, I don't see a real theological difference between the theology of our confession, chapter 7, paragraph 1, and the Westminster Confession, chapter 7, paragraph 1. Thirdly, in the third place, the third theological consequence. Covenants, we confess, are voluntary, not necessary. In covenants, God makes blessings available to man which he is not obligated to give them. God also makes demands of man that go beyond the law of nature, that is, positive laws. Covenants are voluntary. They exist by the will of God alone. So where does this lead theologically? It leads to the argument that each covenant which God makes is what it is, purely by God's sovereign imposition and institution. Covenants are entirely positive, entirely voluntary. Covenants are not a part of the creator-creature relationship. Covenants are not a part of nature. Covenants are only what they are when God says, you will do these things. I will give you these blessings and benefits. Before God makes those demands or makes those promises, they don't even exist. Because covenants are not natural. They don't exist in creation. God must institute such things. Man owes God obedience naturally, yes. But the positive laws that God uses to make covenants and the rewards that come as a result of obeying those laws, all of that is voluntary. All of that is what God has made it to be. And so therefore, what a given covenant is cannot be determined by what another covenant is. The details of one covenant are purely by virtue of the voluntary institution of God. And so if you say, I'm going to understand this covenant based on the details of another covenant, they're not the same thing. God institutes this covenant with these details in this way, and the scriptures attest to that. And God establishes this covenant with these details in this way, and the scriptures attest to that. And we must not use one covenant to be the shape of another covenant. We must not use one covenant to reason about the details of another covenant. Each one plays its own role in the unfolding mystery of Christ. There's no necessary connection between any two covenants because they are voluntary. In other words, because one is inaugurated with blood, it does not follow necessarily that all covenants require bloodshed. Just because one covenant has a sign that is applied to the children of the federal head, it does not follow necessarily that any other covenant, if it has a sign, should apply those signs to the natural offspring of the federal head. If I promise to give Rich Barcelos $10, it does not mean that I have promised to give you $10. You see, the agreement only exists between me and Dr. Barcelos by virtue of the details which have been proposed and agreed to. And if I command Rich Barcelos to give me $10, it does not mean that I have commanded everyone to give me $10. No business contract determines the nature of another business contract by necessity because they're voluntary. You make this contract with this person, it has nothing to do in any necessary way with a business contract you'd make with someone else. You just made up those details with this person, that's fine. You make up the details with another person, and that's fine. But these two documents don't determine one another. Covenants are voluntary, not necessary. And so that means as we do theology, as we do covenant theology, we have to be careful about the reasoning that we use or the argumentation that we employ if we reason from one covenant to another. Most of the time, that will be illegitimate. You must prove your assertions about covenants from revelation, not from necessary consequences, because covenants are not necessary. They're voluntary. Fourthly, covenants elevate man. They do not bring God down. The confessions state that in covenant, God condescends. But what is the nature of this covenantal condescension? This condescension does not mean that God changes himself to relate to his creatures with whom he covenants. God is not able to be changed. And God's relative attributes are the attribution of new titles as man experiences God's eternal blessedness in new ways. God remains unchanged, blessed forever, but man begins to receive new blessings and attributes new names to God as a result. We change from not experiencing certain blessings to experiencing certain blessings. God elevates us, but the infinite God who blesses us has not changed. So the condescension of God in covenant is not found in bringing God down to man, but in God bringing man up to himself when he had no obligation to do so. Remember that covenants provide blessings for man which would otherwise be unavailable. And God is pleased to deal with us, not with, as John Owen said, not with the absolute rigor of what he could require. He does not treat us with the absolute rigor of what a master could require of a servant, but rather he is pleased and kind and gracious, not to leave us in our created or fallen states, but to covenant with us and to treat us kindly and bountifully by giving us blessings which we do not deserve and could not otherwise obtain. This is the condescension of God in covenant. God does not bring himself down to us in any ontological sense whatsoever, but rather he brings us up to himself. As Job learned from Elihu and God, your righteousness does not make him better. Your wickedness does not make him worse. You do not add to God. You do not subtract to God. And God does not have to subtract himself or add to himself in order to relate to us in covenant. When we consider the beatific vision, when we consider what God gives himself, that God gives himself to the elect to satisfy the creature with a glory and perfection that brings everlasting blessedness, then we truly see the condescension of God in granting the most infinite reward, not just to undeserving creatures, but to sinners who once lived in hatred and rebellion against him. The condescension of God is that sinners like us would enjoy the beatific vision, that he would elevate us to that glory, That is God's condescension, not God coming down to us. Now, does God bring us to that glory through the condescension of incarnation? Yes, certainly he does. But covenant is not ontological condescension. Fifthly, covenantal commands test man's loyalty. Because covenants are voluntary, not necessary, their positive laws are not moral or natural matters. Positive laws are things indifferent in themselves. Prior to the institution of circumcision, it was not necessary. It's a thing indifferent in itself. But by virtue of the command, it becomes necessary. So also with animal sacrifices and all their positive laws. Prior to the institution of baptism, baptism was not necessary. It did not exist. And so therefore, when God gives us positive laws, if we look at the law itself, we find it to be an indifferent thing. That then tests us. Will you obey? Because all that matters is God commanded you to do it. The thing itself, don't worry about that. It's indifferent in itself. But God told you to do it. Will you do it? Covenantal commands, therefore, test man's loyalty. When God forbids the eating of the fruit from a particular tree, what matters is not whether the fruit looks good to eat or may make one wise. All that matters is whether God has bidden or forbidden. Positive laws test our loyalty. Will you obey? God says, worship me on my day with my people in my house. Will you obey? Our God in the new covenant commands us to do many things. Do we do them begrudgingly, or do we do them gratefully? Do we do them with joy because our gracious covenant God has commanded them, or do we do them because we know we are supposed to? As pastors, let us always lead our people in a way that shows outwardly a love for God's laws, a love for God's ordinances that is rooted in a love for the God of those laws and the God of those ordinances. We love this because you commanded us to do it. We love to do this thing because you, O our great and bountiful and gracious God, have told us to do it. Sixthly and lastly, covenantal blessings demonstrate God's goodness. This should be an obvious point, an evident point, but I want to conclude here that God's condescension to bless man in covenant provides abundant testimony to his goodness. Even the wicked enjoy his sunshine. Even the wicked enjoy his rain and seed time and harvest. Even the wicked enjoy covenant blessings in the Noahic covenant every day. God is bountiful and kind and loving to his creatures. He loves all in this sense of doing good to all. His goodness is evident to the believer and the unbeliever, to all mankind. We see and we experience his goodness every day. But the point that I really want to emphasize here is similar to the previous one. As pastors, as we celebrate the Lord's Supper and as we preach and as we administer baptism, let us be sure to exalt and praise the God of the covenant, whose promises are declared in the word pictured and the word preached. We should be sure to remind our people all these covenant blessings, this table, this feast that is set before us, where did it come from? From nowhere other than the goodness and the gracious mercy of God given to us freely in Jesus Christ. When we remember that covenants are God condescending to elevate man and to give him things that he does not deserve by a natural relationship and could not deserve in any other way but by covenant, we see God's goodness and graciousness. And when he is covenanted unto us, Jesus Christ himself, and in him all things, then we ought to say to our people, behold the bounty and goodness of our God to us. And the ordinances of the covenant are designed to remind us of this. This is my body. This is my blood given for you. As ministers, we need to be sure to remind the people, behold God's bounty, behold God's goodness unto us, his blessed people. If the creature cannot obtain a reward, how much less can the sinner gain entrance into light and life everlasting? But God has given us his Son, and in him all things. God has covenanted forgiveness, renovation, adoption, perseverance, and glorification. He has covenanted blessing upon blessing to his people, and his blessings demonstrate his goodness. Praised be his holy name.